one other question I might sort of pose to both of you is, what is the cadence on which companies should respond? Because one of the big challenges that a lot of our customers say now is, hey, it's not just that there is a new policy that's coming down the pipeline, it's that this new policy might be legit, it might be real long term, or it might just be negotiating leverage that'll get unwound in 3 months. And so nobody wants to radically change their supply chain overnight and then find that they made a quick decision when they didn't need to. So I'm kind of curious, how do you think about the pace at which folks should be responding to policy changes? As part of that, what are you seeing as the opportunities or drawbacks to changing your suppliers? And so maybe I'll ask a little bit about Ebehi on your perspective and then go to you, David.
Yeah, I think one thing that's very interesting about the current trade environment, and it's fundamentally true just in principle with our models, is in the game of tariffs and in the game of trade policy, responding to trade policy, it's not just about what's happening in your organization. It's also about what's happening to your competitors, right? So if, for example, everyone in the industry sources a very specific, important input and everybody has to source that from China, you know that you're all going to be hit the same way and your costs are all going to be affected. So that's not something that's going to be a competitive disadvantage for you. Whereas if it turns out that there's a lot of diversified sourcing in your industry, so some of your competitors are sourcing from Vietnam or from Malaysia while you are sourcing from China, and then there's a difference in the tariffs that are being levied on China versus Vietnam, that all of a sudden it might look like a competitive opportunity for your competitor and a loss for you. And so one of the key things here, and I'll bring it to something that David talks about quite frequently, which is data. There is a lot of good data out there that can actually help you figure out which of your direct materials have this kind of competitive kind of asymmetry, and which of these have these kind of competitive symmetries where you should be less worried about a competitive advantage developing very quickly for your competitors. And for some of that data is publicly available. You can look at publicly available customs data to really see some of your key inputs, those HS codes. What is your industry? Where's your industry's main sources? How diversified are those sources versus how concentrated are those? But then there's also your private information, your data on how are you tracking how long it took you to find a supplier the last time you needed to change? Maybe not for trade policy reasons, but for any other reason. Do you know what the bottlenecks for your own sourcing are? Do you have a data-driven way to identify that? And that will really inform a lot of the decisions around how reactive you should be, whether this is a competitive opportunity or, challenge, and also whether, for you personally, there's a big bottleneck to be able to adjust. And so you want to have visibility on that in the short term.
I mean, I would add to that with a very specific procurement lens. So there's two things that you need to consider. The first is, and this is my Amazonian bias kicking in,
Sure,
is customer obsession. Like, what is the impact to the customer, right? Like, how will this impact my customer? And then prioritizing the efforts to minimize the impact to the customer. The second is what we do as a procurement organization. We get measured, usually, we could justify our existence with savings and risk mitigation, right? So at the end of the day, if we're doing our job and we're maintaining the profit margins for our company to roll with the punches, that gives us the time to move from reaction to response.
yes.
So the two things that we can do constantly is understand what is the parts of our supply chain that are critical to our ability to deliver to our customers,
Right.
do we understand what our competitors are doing, right? So the very first thing that I did when all this happened, I'm not supposed to use the T word, when all of this happened is I went to the hs.gov website and I tried to download all of the import information for the last 3 years for every single HS code from every single country. If we're buying a lot of our raw materials from a country that was targeted and there's not a lot of other spend imported into the US in that same category, that's probably a problem.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is that in the highly commoditized world that we live in, generally supply chains are very similar. And so making sure that we can service the customer, pushing the costs where we can, but minimizing the need to do that by constantly being cost obsessed as a procurement organization are the things that we can really focus on. That's within our control.
Mm-hmm. This is fascinating. By the way, this could be a multi-hour long seminar on each of these topics. I love the concept of some suppliers providing goods that are commoditized where the substitutability is very high versus specialty where the switching cost is very difficult. And something that Ebehi you'd mentioned is it doesn't have to be based on the volume of spend. That it could be that 80% of your bill of materials, you could easily find an alternative supplier, but it's really maybe that 20%. For Tesla, this would have been specialty computing products where we would have to dual source because if one goes down, it doesn't mean that we can all of a sudden spin up a different supplier versus things like stampings and plastics. As painful as it might be, there's always a way to get prototypes built. And David, I agree with you. Some of the challenges related to supplier switching, it's not as trivial as people seem to make it seem.